Robert almost skipped his checkup that morning. He'd felt fine, a little more tired than usual climbing the stairs, maybe, but nothing worth mentioning. Then I pulled up an image on the screen and pointed to something he'd never thought about in 68 years of living, the inside of his own arteries. What he saw surprised him. What surprised him more was learning that almost everything he believed about protecting his heart, the eggs he'd cut out, the butter he'd replaced, had only ever addressed half the problem. The other half, the part that actually matters most after 60, almost nobody talks about. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that other half is, and the one meal that research suggests may help your body work with you instead of against you. Hi, I'm glad you're here. If you're over 60, or you're watching this for a parent or spouse who is, today we're going to walk through something that affects nearly every one of us as we age, whether we feel it yet or not. The slow, quiet narrowing of the arteries that can eventually lead to serious problems like heart attack or stroke. But instead of just scaring you with what can go wrong, I want to show you something more useful, a specific science-backed meal that supports the processes your arteries rely on to stay flexible and clear. This isn't a fad, and it isn't a miracle cure. It's a practical habit grounded in real nutritional science that fits into an ordinary week. Along the way, I'll share Robert's story, one of my patients whose experience might feel familiar to you or someone you love. We'll talk about why so many well-meaning efforts to eat healthy for your heart quietly fall short. And I'll break down piece by piece exactly what makes this particular combination of foods so effective and how to make it your own. Before we go further, let me introduce myself properly. I'm Dr. Andrea Reyes, and I've spent much of my career working with older adults navigating exactly this kind of question: how to protect their heart health without feeling overwhelmed or restricted. I want to be upfront about something important. This video is educational. It's meant to help you understand your body better and have more informed conversations with your own doctor, not to replace personalized medical care. If you're currently taking blood thinners, cholesterol medication, or blood pressure medication, some of what we discussed today, including certain foods, can interact with those medications. Please talk to your doctor before making any changes to your diet. My goal isn't to hand you a rule book, it's to give you clarity so you can make decisions that actually make sense for your life. Now let me tell you about Robert. He's 68, a retired postal worker who spent 30 years walking routes, rain or shine. And these days he lives a quieter life, cooking simple meals for one, taking his dog around the block each morning, trying to keep the arthritis in his knee from slowing him down too much. His wife passed a few years ago, and cooking for one, he told me, just isn't the same. Breakfast is usually coffee and toast. Lunch is whatever's easiest. Dinner tends to be heavier. Some red meat, maybe a potato. Not much in the way of vegetables. His blood pressure runs a little high. His cholesterol sits right at that borderline number I keep mentioning at his visits. And his father had a heart attack at 62, a fact that sits quietly in the back of Robert's mind more often than he'd admit. Robert isn't in crisis. He's not in an emergency room. He's just at risk in that quiet, easy-to-ignore way so many of us are. And that's exactly why his story matters. Because it was during a routine checkup, the kind you might be due for yourself, that I mentioned something on his imaging that changed how Robert thought about food entirely. That's where his story begins, and I'll bring you back to it as it unfolds through the rest of this video. So let's talk about what's actually happening inside your arteries as you get older, because understanding this is what makes everything else in this video make sense. Your arteries aren't just pipes carrying blood from point A to point B. They're living, active tissue, lined with a thin layer of cells called the endothelium. Think of it almost like the inner wallpaper of a garden hose. When that lining is healthy, it's smooth, flexible, and able to expand and contract as needed. But over time, particularly when there's excess LDL cholesterol circulating in the blood, some of it can slip beneath that lining. Once it's there, your immune system treats it almost like an intruder. White blood cells rush in to deal with it, and in the process, that cholesterol can become oxidized, chemically altered in a way that makes it even more likely to trigger inflammation. This sets off a kind of repair response that, ironically, backfires. Instead of just cleaning things up, it can lead to a buildup of plaque, a mixture of cholesterol, immune cells, and calcium that gradually narrows the space inside the artery, the same way mineral buildup narrows the inside of an old garden hose until barely any water gets through. Here's what I really want you to take away from this. For decades, the public conversation about heart health focused almost entirely on cholesterol numbers. Get your LDL down, avoid saturated fat, and you're covered. But research over the past couple of decades has increasingly pointed to something else playing an equally important role: inflammation and the health of that endothelial lining itself. Two people can have identical cholesterol numbers and yet very different outcomes depending on how much inflammation is happening in their blood vessels. This is why the common mistake, thinking of arterial health as purely a cholesterol math problem, leaves out half the picture. It's not just what's floating around in your blood, it's how your body is responding to it. I want you to notice something subtle here because it matters. Early plaque buildup often causes no symptoms at all. That's part of what makes it so dangerous, and also part of why it's worth being proactive now, rather than waiting for a warning sign that might not come until it's more serious. Robert didn't have chest pain. He didn't have shortness of breath that alarmed him. He had a slightly harder time on the stairs, which he chalked up to his knee. It wasn't until I looked closely that the reality became clear. And when Robert asked me, almost defensively, "But I already cut back on eggs. Isn't that supposed to help?" I gave him an answer that surprised him. That's a conversation worth sharing with you now, because Robert's question is one so many of my patients ask, and the honest answer reveals exactly why so many heart-healthy efforts don't work the way people expect. Let's talk about the mistakes, the well-intentioned ones, the ones that feel like they should work and yet quietly don't deliver the results people hope for. The first, and probably the most common, is exactly what Robert did, focusing almost entirely on dietary cholesterol, like eggs, while ignoring inflammation and blood sugar. This isn't Robert's fault. It's the advice a lot of us grew up hearing. But dietary cholesterol turns out to have a much smaller effect on blood cholesterol for most people than once believed, while chronic inflammation and elevated blood sugar play a much larger role than most people realize. Cutting out eggs while still eating a diet high in refined carbohydrates and low in anti-inflammatory foods is a bit like patching one hole in a boat while ignoring 3 others. The second mistake is one I see constantly in my practice, and I understand exactly why people fall into it, reaching for a supplement marketed as an artery cleanser or heart support formula. The appeal makes sense. It feels proactive, it's easy, and the marketing can be very convincing. But the honest truth is that most of these products lack strong evidence behind their bold claims, and relying on them can create a false sense of security, leading people to feel protected while skipping the conversations and changes that actually matter. Robert, in fact, tried something like this. A friend recommended a supplement he'd seen advertised, and he took it faithfully for months. When he mentioned it at his checkup, hoping for good news, I gently explained there simply wasn't evidence it was doing what he hoped. Robert wasn't embarrassed once he realized how common this is, and if you've done something similar, you're in good company. This happens to thoughtful, careful people all the time. The third mistake is going to the opposite extreme, deciding to overhaul everything overnight. Cutting out entire food groups, adopting a rigid new diet with little room for enjoyment, and then, predictably, abandoning it within a few weeks because it simply isn't sustainable. Lasting heart health isn't built on dramatic short bursts of willpower. It's built on small, repeatable habits that fit into an actual life. And the fourth mistake, one that's especially important for anyone over 60, is not accounting for medication interactions when making dietary changes. This is a big one, and I'll come back to it in more detail later, but it's worth planting here. Certain heart-healthy foods, particularly leafy greens rich in vitamin K, can interact with blood-thinning medications like warfarin. Making dietary changes without your doctor's awareness, even genuinely healthy ones, can sometimes create new problems. This is exactly why I keep coming back to this idea with my patients. Real progress happens in partnership with your medical team, not around them. The encouraging news is this. Despite all these dead ends, there is a body of research that consistently points towards something that works. Not a single miracle ingredient, but a specific, well-studied combination of foods that support the processes we just talked about. Reducing inflammation, protecting that delicate endothelial lining, and helping your body manage cholesterol more effectively. That's what I want to unpack with you next. So what does the research actually point to? Several categories of nutrients keep showing up again and again in studies of cardiovascular and arterial health. Omega-3 fatty acids, dietary nitrates found in leafy greens, polyphenols, plant compounds with antioxidant properties, and soluble fiber. Individually, each plays a distinct role. Together, they appear to work in complementary ways, which is really the heart of what I want to build toward with you. Let's take them one at a time, starting with omega-3 fatty acids, found abundantly in fatty fish like salmon. These fats have been studied extensively for their role in reducing inflammation throughout the body, including within blood vessel walls. Think of chronic inflammation almost like a repair crew that never gets the signal to stop working. It keeps sending resources to a site long after the job should be done, causing collateral damage in the process. Omega-3s appear to help send that stand-down signal more effectively, calming an overactive inflammatory response. Next, dietary nitrates, found richly in leafy greens like spinach and Swiss chard. Once consumed, these compounds can be converted in the body into nitric oxide, a molecule that helps blood vessels relax and dilate. Picture your arteries as having a kind of internal valve system. Nitric oxide helps that valve stay flexible rather than stiff, allowing blood to flow more easily and reducing strain on the vessel walls. Then there's fiber, particularly the soluble kind found in foods like legumes, oats, and certain vegetables. Soluble fiber has a well-documented ability to bind with cholesterol in the digestive tract, functioning almost like a sponge that helps carry some of that cholesterol out of the body rather than letting it circulate. And polyphenols, found in walnuts, olive oil, and citrus, act as antioxidants, helping to reduce the oxidative damage that makes LDL cholesterol more likely to trigger that harmful inflammatory cascade we discussed earlier. What's important to understand is that this isn't about chasing a single superfood. Nutrition science has increasingly moved away from that idea and toward recognizing that these nutrients tend to work best in combination as part of a whole food rather than isolated in a pill or powder. That's precisely the thinking I shared with Robert, not as a strict prescription, but as an evidence-based pattern he could realistically build into his week. Something shifted for him when I explained it that way. For the first time, this didn't feel like deprivation to him. It felt like information he could actually use. Before we get to the meal itself, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, let me know, which of those mistakes we just covered sounds the most familiar? Maybe you've tried a supplement that didn't quite live up to its promises. Or maybe, like Robert, you focused mostly on cutting cholesterol without thinking about inflammation. You're far from alone, and it genuinely helps others watching to see they're not the only ones. Now let's get into exactly what this meal looks like. Here it is, a baked salmon fillet served alongside sautéed leafy greens like spinach or Swiss chard, a small handful of walnuts, and a simple citrus and olive oil dressing drizzled over the top. If you'd like, you can round it out with a modest serving of legumes or a whole grain like quinoa or brown rice for additional fiber. On its own, that might sound like just another healthy dinner, but when you understand why each piece is there, it becomes something more intentional. The salmon provides those omega-3 fatty acids we talked about, working to calm inflammation. The leafy greens supply dietary nitrates, supporting healthy blood vessel flexibility, along with fiber of their own. The walnuts add another source of omega-3s, alongside polyphenols that help protect against oxidative damage. The olive oil contributes heart-healthy monounsaturated fats and its own antioxidant compounds. And the citrus, a simple squeeze of lemon or orange, adds vitamin C, which plays a supporting role in maintaining the collagen structure that keeps blood vessel walls strong and resilient. Individually, none of these foods is some newly discovered secret. What matters is bringing them together, intentionally, in a pattern that research suggests supports your arteries from multiple directions at once, rather than relying on any single ingredient to do all the work. As for how often to eat something like this, there's no rigid rule carved in stone. But incorporating a meal along these lines 2 to 3 times a week as part of an overall varied and balanced diet is a reasonable, realistic target for most people. This isn't about eating this exact meal every single day. It's about the pattern it represents becoming a regular part of how you eat. And here's an important note, one I mentioned earlier and want to underline clearly. If you're on a blood-thinning medication like warfarin, the vitamin K content in leafy greens like spinach and chard can affect how that medication works. This doesn't mean you need to avoid them. It means the amount and consistency of leafy greens you eat should be something you discuss with your doctor, so your medication can be managed appropriately alongside your diet. Now let me tell you what happened with Robert, because knowing what to eat and actually making it part of your life are two very different things. And this is where his story gets really honest. At first, he was hesitant. Cooking fish felt intimidating to him. He worried about it tasting off or overcooking it into something rubbery. So he started small. He picked up a bag of frozen salmon fillet, which turned out to be far more forgiving and affordable than he expected. He kept a bag of walnuts in the pantry for snacking, which did double duty toward his weekly totals. The first attempt wasn't perfect, a little dry, he admitted with a laugh, but by the third try, he'd found a rhythm. A simple seasoning of salt, pepper, and lemon, baked while he prepped the greens, in the same pan he used for everything else. He didn't overhaul his entire diet overnight, and that's exactly the point. He started with this meal twice a week. Then, as it became familiar rather than effortful, it crept up to 3 times without him really trying. At his next checkup with me, there wasn't some dramatic transformation to report, no single dramatic number that changed everything. But Robert mentioned feeling a bit more energetic on his walks, and I was glad to see he'd made a sustainable change he could actually stick with, one that fit into his life rather than fighting against it. I like to remind patients like Robert of something simple but true. Consistency over months matters far more than perfection over days. Robert didn't need to be perfect. He needed to keep showing up, one dinner at a time. Before we wrap up, I want to spend a moment on something responsible I feel is important to cover, because this meal, like any dietary change, isn't universally risk-free for every single person. And I'd rather you hear that from me clearly than not hear it at all. We've already talked about the interaction between leafy greens and blood-thinning medications, so if that applies to you, please loop your doctor in. If you have a fish or shellfish allergy, or a tree nut allergy, obviously salmon or walnuts aren't the right fit for you, and that's completely fine. The underlying nutrients they provide, like omega-3s, can often be found through other sources your doctor or a dietitian can help you identify. If you're living with kidney disease, some of the foods we've discussed today, particularly around potassium and phosphorus content, may need to be adjusted based on your specific situation. So please don't take this as one-size-fits-all guidance. And I want to say this plainly, nothing in this video should ever replace a prescribed medication. Diet can be a powerful ally alongside your treatment plan, but it isn't a substitute for it. My goal in sharing all of this isn't to make you afraid, it's to make sure you're genuinely informed so you can have a real productive conversation with your own doctor about what's right for you. So let's bring this back to where we started. Robert's story doesn't end with some dramatic cure. Real life rarely works that way, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I promised you otherwise. What it ends with is something quieter and honestly more meaningful. A retired man who once felt overwhelmed by conflicting advice about heart health found one specific, realistic habit he could actually maintain, built on real science rather than guesswork. He still sees me regularly. He still takes his medication as prescribed. But now, food feels less like a source of anxiety and more like something within his control. The lessons here are worth holding on to. Your arteries respond to more than just cholesterol numbers. Inflammation and vessel flexibility matter just as much, if not more. The meal we walked through today, salmon, leafy greens, walnuts, olive oil, and citrus, works because it addresses multiple parts of that picture at once, not because any single ingredient is magic. Supplements promising quick fixes rarely deliver what they promise, and drastic, unsustainable changes tend to fade before they can help you. What actually works is consistency, built one realistic choice at a time, alongside, never instead of, the guidance of your own doctor. If there's one thing I hope you take from this video, it's that it's genuinely never too late to support your heart health, wherever you're starting from today. Small, informed changes, sustained over time, matter more than most people realize. If this video helped bring some clarity to something that's felt confusing or overwhelming, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like the video and subscribe, so more people like Robert can find their way to information they can actually trust and use.